Hi, I'm Greg Milan. I'm the system architect for Alfresco Content Services and one of the architects defining the shape of the Alfresco digital business platform. Today I'll be talking about content services. These are the services that let you manage and share content. On the whiteboard behind me, I've drawn a picture of the components of Alfresco Content Services. Let's take a look at the details. At the bottom of the stack, we have the content repository. This is where your content lives. For the metadata, we chose an open standard SQL implementation, and in that SQL database, we implemented a key value schema that allows us to evolve the shape of the data over time. That way, you can evolve the data as your business needs require. For the bits, the things like file system content, we chose the file system. That gives you capabilities like disk mirroring, encryption, and backup, and avoids the database size limits for blobs. All of that content, the metadata and the binary content, it's organized into what we call content stores, depending on the characteristics of the content. So for example, we have an archive content store where you can safely restore or delete content. We have a versioning content store where we take immutable snapshots of the content and allow you to do time travel, safe time travel. And we have a working content store where you can make edits as you need to. Now all of that content, all of the content in those data stores, it's all indexed using a powerful search technology based on Apache Solr 6. Solr 6 is one of those technologies Alfresco is a leader in. We've invented capabilities like document fingerprinting to associate two documents that might be similar. We've invented sharding, which is a way of scaling out an index to get infinite scale. And by being members of the community, we've also accepted contributions for things like streaming. Now, if you peek inside of our implementation, you see we followed a very secure pattern where we've got a service implementation and a service interface. You can rely on the service interface being preserved while we change the implementation behind the scenes. And all of that's wired together using Spring technology. And early on, the very beginning, we needed a proven, reliable runtime for all of this. And we chose Java. That gave us access to a growing list of libraries, as well as the secure runtime facilities of Java. Moving up the stack, let's look at security and access control. Key to security and access control is first knowing who the user is. To do that, we rely on services your organization is already using. For example, if you're using Microsoft AD, we'll rely on that directory service to tell us who that user is. If you're using LDAP, we'll rely on LDAP. And you can always use Alfresco's built-in directory service. We also employ support for SAML and Kerberos for single sign-on. Knowing who the user is then allows us to apply proper access control to make sure that the user only does that which the user is authorized to do. Regardless, whatever a user does with a piece of content, we track that fact in an immutable audit log, so you could always go back and trace the history of a piece of content over time. So now let's look at content organization and flow. Content has different kinds of organization, different flows, different metadata, different formats. And in order to properly handle all of those facts, the first order of business is to allow the user to properly classify the content. And for that, we have types, associations, aspects, and models. A type is basically the kind of object an object is. So for example, a file is of a file type. An association is just a link between two kinds of objects. So the fact that a file is in a folder is expressed through an association. Now, aspects are interesting. It's something Alfresco invented. It's a dynamic bundle of metadata that you can attach to an object of any type. And finally, you can organize your types, associations, and aspects using models that helps you manage all of these different classification schemes. Now, to properly handle the flow of content, we define something called a rule. A rule is triggered when a certain kind of operation, when a certain fact has been reached. So for example, when an invoice has exceeded a certain dollar value, a rule can be triggered. When an object has a tag of legal review, a certain rule can be triggered. When an object hasn't been touched in a while, a certain rule can be triggered. So what do you do with these rules? Well, what you want to do is hook those rules up into actions. So for example, if an invoice exceeds a certain dollar value, that rule is triggered, and you can move that file containing the invoice into a big deals folder. Or if a file has the tag legal review, you could send that to your legal review team for review and approval. And if a file hasn't been changed in a while, that rule gets triggered and you might want to throw that into an archive folder, transforming it first into a PDF. Now, if those rules and actions aren't enough for you to control the flow of your content, you could use what we call behaviors and policies. Behaviors you could attach through policies to an object to allow you an even finer level of control. So just before an object is stored in the database, you could trigger a certain behavior, or just afterwards a certain behavior can be triggered. Now, all of that is using the metadata about an object. Where does that metadata come from? Well, the easy answer is the metadata is supplied by the business user using a dynamic form, and we support that. But we also support the ability to extract the metadata automatically from the object as it's put into the repository. So we could take the metadata and create an aspect, for example, and from that aspect you can drive a rule and all kinds of other behavior. Another way of organizing your content is using something we call smart folders. Now, smart folders are basically a way for you to define a SQL query to comprise the organization of your folder structure. So, for example, you could say the content of this folder is the result of a certain SQL query or a certain search query. That allows your business user to define the shape of the content using dynamic rules, so they don't have to worry about how the content is organized over time. We'll take care of that housekeeping for you. At the very top of the stack, we have the access services. These are the means by which you gain access to all the content services I've been describing. To start with, we have something called CMIS, Content Management Interoperability Services. This is a standard RESTful protocol that gains access to all the files and folders in Alfresco. Alfresco led the development of that standard and also provided the first full implementation. There are also a number of protocols, some of which have been around for decades. These include protocols like WebDAV, CIFS, FTP, and IMAP. The advantage these protocols provide is that you're already using clients that know how to talk to these protocols. So for example, if you're using the Windows desktop, it knows how to talk WebDAV to a folder, and you can mount Alfresco as if it were a folder. So it appears to the end user in the Windows desktop as a folder would. And if I drag a file and drop it on that folder, that file will get stored in Alfresco and potentially trigger a rule. We also provide a service we call Alfresco Office Services. If you're using Office technology like Word or PowerPoint or Excel, behind the scenes what's happening is those applications are talking to a protocol that Microsoft invented to talk to Microsoft technology. Well, Alfresco has emulated that protocol, which means that if you're using one of those applications and you're, for example, looking to save a file from Excel into Alfresco, that can happen directly without you having to install any extra software. You can look at the metadata properties of an object directly from one of those applications or the version history, as if you were talking to Microsoft technology. And finally, if everything I've described isn't enough and you need a new API, you can invent a new API using a technology we call WebScript. It can be written in JavaScript, in Java, or even HTML and deployed dynamically to the Alfresco server. So I hope you found that interesting and informative. I invite you to watch other videos about the Alfresco Digital Business Platform. I'd be interested in your feedback about the platform or about the videos. Thank you so much for your time.